So I'm going to start by introducing myself. I've been in security for about 17 years. I kind of went full force when I joined the intelligence community. So I worked, with the intelligence community on cybersecurity from Afghanistan through Iraq. I was deep in operations, worked in a Faraday cage, the whole thing. And then I transitioned from that to doing my PhD at Stanford, where I worked somewhat with Dan Bonet, who's in the back. A lot of my thesis was in the security space. And then from there, I went to start a company called Nicira, which that was kind of a 9-year arc. Ended up getting acquired by VMware. And by the time I left, the product was at about a $600 million run rate, and about 50% of that was security. So I've kind of had this kind of circuitous path in and out of security. I've given a lot of talks. I've heard a lot of talks on security. And it feels like so many of them start kind of like this, and they follow like this template, which is the attackers are getting worse, our defenses aren't keeping up, we're losing the arms race, let me show you a bunch of anecdotes, etc. And that's kind of the way that we like to scare people into security. And I really don't want this to be one of those talks. I actually think that there's a much more constructive way to break down the industry and to think about it. And so the goal of this talk is to provide a high-level framework of how we in the firm view security, how we view trends that affect security, the creativity, the cycle, and where we are right now, and how we can use that to kind of predict where security is going. But I will start with a trope, because security talks love tropes, and the trope is comparing digital security to physical security. So physical security, we like to talk about patterns, right? Especially when we're talking about cybersecurity. So a very popular pattern we talk about is the arms race, right? So what's an arms race? An arms race is you've got two sides, and they kind of incrementally get better weapons, so you're in constant conflict of, increasing magnitude. Another thing that we like to talk about is this point of diminishing returns. Again, another trope that we like in security talks, which says, if I add incremental more dollars, I'm going to kind of asymptotically approach some norm that doesn't help me, so I'm not going to get material gains after a period of time. And I think these are very useful concepts when talking about security, sure, but I think when you take the lens, like a broad lens strategically in cybersecurity and physical security, they're not all that accurate. So there's another concept in physical security we talk about, which is misalignment. Whenever you have a misalignment, something in the battlefield changes, and it requires you to entirely change tactics and entirely change strategies. And if I think we take a long view of cybersecurity, we've seen some massive misalignments that have created enormous growth in the industry. I think we're just coming out of one right now and entering another one. So I want to talk a little bit about what misalignment has meant in the physical world, and then I'm going to talk about what it means in the cyber world. Okay, let's talk about misalignment. Another trope in security, the walled city. Of course, the way in the medieval time that we used to protect people is we'd have cities with large walls. We'd put everybody behind those walls under times of duress. And then to attack, you'd break walls. To defend, you'd pour oil over walls, or you would defend walls. And that basically dictated weapons, defenses, strategies, everything. And that lasted for quite a while. But then the battlefield changed, or the world changed, and that populations grew much faster than our ability to build castles with big walls. And this gave rise to mobile infantry. So now you had an entirely new set of tactics and strategies around supply chains, around mobility. You had the cavalry come up, and that dictated the books on military strategy for quite some time until the world changed again. And now you've got airplanes, right? So you unlock the Z dimension, the third dimension, and this entirely changed defense. I mean, we had the Maginot Line in World War II. It entirely changed offense. So anytime you have a misalignment, it's not like an arms race, which I think is a bad analogy. The arms race says, I have one new weapon, and that will change from a symmetric to an asymmetric battlefield. And this says you have these massive changes in the battlefield, and that requires both sides to entirely retool. So I want to take a look at cybersecurity in this lens. So I believe we're just coming out of maybe a 10 to 15-year-long misalignment. And that was when we went from client-server to cloud and mobile. Client-server came out of course, the days of the internet where you had clients, you had servers, they connected to each other. The majority of the connectivity happened over the internet. And the way that we prevented against these things, we used things like firewalls and IDSs. And so there wasn't a large aggregation of information in one place. There wasn't a lot on the internet. Connectivity was fairly well understood. And then mechanisms worked for kind of what we wanted. And then came the time of cloud. So let's say in the early 2000s, we started building bigger and bigger data centers. We were aggregating a ton of information in one place. And things that were built during the times of client servers really couldn't be pushed into service in these new mechanisms because they, for example, couldn't handle the bandwidth. Or they couldn't handle the sophistication of the attack that happened. So when I was a PhD in 2003 to 2007, this was like the topic of conversation. The entire thesis was we have these networks and these security devices that have evolved out of the internet era, where, oh, by the way, everybody's supposed to talk to everybody. And now we're in a different area where everybody's afraid of like the internet where every psychopath is your next door neighbor. And we didn't have the technology to put into play because we had this massive aggregation in one place. We had many different ways of connecting, things like mobile, and this required the entire security industry to retool. And we've seen this happen over the last decade. So I'd say that the misalignment in this period was much higher concentration of compute and data in one place, many more methods of access. Of course, much more valuable information was there, which would spur on the attackers to become ever more sophisticated. So what I would like to do is I would actually take to this misalignment in a little more depth, because I think it actually talks about how the security industry has evolved over the last decade or so. And I think the best way to talk about this is to actually walk through a canonicalized kill chain, like how a sophisticated attacker will break in, find data, and steal that data. So this kill chain was put together by myself and a guy named Tom Korn. He used to be the CSO of RSA. He worked for me then at VMware for a while. We looked through a number of attacks, and this also includes attacks that we know about from the intelligence community. It's fully canonicalized, but this is based on real data. So let's assume that someone is trying to break into Acme Corporation. This is like a fairly traditional model of how this would happen today. So the first thing that the attacker will do is human recon. I mean, there's more information online than ever before, whether it's through LinkedIn or through Facebook. You can reconstruct organizational charts. You can know about people's professional affiliations and personal affiliations, what they're interested in and who they know. Often, the way that you break into an organization is use a human. Once you've identified a target or an entrant, then you do your attack vector R&D, which is you're going to try and build something special versus to breaking in. There are tools that are available that actually offer like 365 days by 24-hour support to allow you to do this, things like Zeus. So you do your R&D, and then you determine the delivery mechanism, such email. So let me give you an example of how this has affected me. So let's see. I'm 40 years old, and the day that I turned 37 years old, I got an email, and that email came from my sister. And it was a very sweet email. There was a picture of us when we were kids, and it said, "Happy birthday, brother. I'm so happy you're my brother. It was really nice to see you last week." There's a picture of us. I'd seen her last week. And I just wanted to wish you a happy birthday. Please click on this link. And my first thought was like, this is so sweet. Like, my sister's never remembered my birthday before, ever. So I look at the mail headers, and of course this had been sent through Russia. I just did basic geolocation on the IP address and been sent through Russia. Now listen, I just sold a company. I'm generally paranoid by nature because I work for the intelligence community. I'm somewhat of a technical dude, and most importantly, I've got a very forgetful sister. And any of these were not true, I would have absolutely clicked on that link for sure. So let's assume I did. Let's assume I clicked on that link. Well, at the time, I was actually logged into the servers at work. So if I would have clicked on that link, quite likely the payload would have come down, infected my laptop, and it would have had access to my work environment. Generally, these days, when malware does infect a computer, it establishes command and control. This is incredibly sophisticated because we often think of attacks as fire and forget, like someone sends some malicious payload and they walk away. The reality is almost all attacks have a human in the loop, and an attacker in the loop was intelligent, it's dedicated, and is patient. So now you've got something established on the laptop. Normally, 2 strains of the malware are downloaded, one that's asleep, one that's awake. And that one that's awake will start to kind of walk around the organization and try and find what's of use. And start to move around. So it'll scan machines, the entire time it's communicating back with the attacker, and so forth. If you're lucky, at some point while this piece of malware is walking around scanning things, you may identify it, someone may identify it for you, that gets cleaned up, at which case strain B wakes up, contacts the attacker, strain C comes down, goes to sleep, strain B now knows what tripped it off, and it'll start continuing the attack. I think we looked at about 10 different attacks, and in 8 of them, there were multiple strains of attack that were used. At some point, and this is after a long period of time, whatever it was looking for is identified. Let's say it's some personal information or credit card information or whatever it is. It'll take that information, parcel it up, often obfuscate it, and then slowly leak it out. Okay, we went from client server to cloud, and because cloud, we have this massive amount of aggregation of data. The attack evolved as a result of that. I mean, this didn't evolve for no reason. It evolved as a result of that. And now you've got a modern kill chain. And if you look at the traditional, this is a very traditional way of doing security, 80% of it was basically keeping the bad guys out and just ignored the rest of this kill chain. Now, this is a retrospective. This is, say, security circa 2007. So what's happened after the last 8 years is the entire industry has responded to deal with this. So every point in this kill chain has at least one, not company, but sector or vertical. And many of these will have 20, 30 companies that are behind them. So we've seen an absolute explosion in security techniques and security methodologies and security companies as a result of this in order to respond. And it's not stopping, right? If you actually look at a most broad view, while IT seems to be flattening out, security spend is increasing. And the only thing that seems to be outpacing that is the amount that we lose on security breaches. Right? So if you kind of take the slider bar and you go out to the future, it's like all of our time and money is going to be spent dealing with security losses. So we've got this ever-increasing trend that's going, and this ever-increasing trend of responses. And so we theorize, and it's probably a little too early to call this a misalignment, but if I look at the companies that walk in the door and I look at the response of the security industry, I think there's been enough technology that's been actually adopted, or a lot of it, to deal with most of the attacks in place. And there's a lot of great technology that's been involved, it's being used, but we actually almost hit a point of security overload and saturation. So I want to talk a little bit about that because it's really dictating what types of companies are being created today and how people are adopting them. So in practice, security is dealt with at companies in a SOC, a security operations center. This is people with screens looking at alerts. I mean, that's what it is. And unfortunately, the amount of alerts is going up asymptotically. The amount of potential technologies you can put them is going up asymptotically, as you see, because we're responding to very legitimate threats and breaches. Yet we have something like a negative 1 million person unemployment rate in the security operations center. And so if you stand back and you take a high-level heat map of the security industry, I don't think it's like building another mechanism or another point product that's the problem now. We've actually got to a point that we can't really consume the technologies that are being created just because the sheer amount of data that they're creating and the lack of people that can consume it. So you start hearing words like buyer's fatigue. You start hearing words like alert fatigue, where there's just so much new to consume. I mean, many of the CSOs that I've become personal friends with over the last decade, by selling them to me, basically say, listen, I don't have the time on my day to answer the emails of the new products that are coming online. Right? There's just so much out there to do it. It's very difficult to keep up. And so what we're seeing is this massive movement in the entire industry to go to what I like to think of as kind of the self-driving SOC. I mean, if I gave you one broad arc that's defining security technologies, like how do you automate this process of people there as far as dealing with the massive amounts of data, automating human processes, codifying domain expertise, and responding to them? And the good news is this aligns with the broader trends of the industry anyways. If you look at like what's come out of the consumer companies, if you look at kind of what's de novo across the board in core computer science, independent of security, their technologies, a lot of them with massive innovations in the last decade, that were built to deal with these types of things like big data, processing a lot of data, AI automation, distributed systems. And I know, listen, these are kind of overall catchphrases, but I do believe that there's core technical innovations underlying them that help. So if I was supposed to stand back and say, okay, what more specifically are we seeing? We're seeing things like, for example, there are companies that will allow you to query in real time your entire IT infrastructure for security threats. Say, for example, those of you that are familiar with Tanium, right? We're seeing very sophisticated use of ML and AI to determine anomalies and detection and to do things like real-time processing of voice. If you're familiar with companies like Pindrop, right? This will actually do real-time analysis of voice for fraud detection. And oh, by the way, voice is an enormously important way of not only accessing, say, your bank account or your telephone account, but now anything is like Alexis and things catch on. There's an entire sector created on security automation, which is automating the SOC. There's probably 40 companies in this space. And we're also seeing, because there's so many endpoints proliferating, we're using modern distributed systems to create single abstractions to manage all of that. So just to catch up, so we've seen this massive explosion in sophistication of attackers. We've seen a commensurate explosion in technology and fantastic technology. And now I think we're seeing this age of kind of automation and simplification. There's dozens of companies that are very interesting. I suggest you look at them. But I actually want to turn the little page because when I was doing this talk, I actually think that the biggest misalignment is not going to be happening in the cyber world. I actually think the cyber world is kind of on its pace. We're going to see a lot of great innovations. But what's been really surprising is how much physical security is starting to be affected by advances in cybersecurity. And I don't think it's an oft-talked about thing, so I just want to spend a little bit of time on that. I'm just going to use this as an example. Physical security business has been around for a long time. Probably the oldest access control mechanism in the history of mankind is the lock. The lock hasn't changed fundamentally in a really long time. A lock is something you have a key. The key should be hard to forge. You give somebody the key, they get access to the lock. Somebody that doesn't have the key doesn't have the access. Sounds great. We've been using it for a long time. If you compare it to computer versions of access control, it's like Neanderthalic. It's so backwards, right? Like, if you think about computer versions of access control, I can tell you exactly who accesses things, when they access it. I will log every access that they have. I can revoke access without, for example, taking away keys and changing locks. I mean, computers and cyber views of security are much, much more sophisticated by the physical world because we're not constrained by atoms, right? We could do things like allow people digital access and revoking access and more sophisticated things. And as we get better at building, say, consumer applications, as if everybody gets an iPhone, we now have this connection to the physical world that allows us to take these incredibly powerful cyber concepts and apply them to physical security. I mean, today there's probably 20 companies that are using smart locks to change physical access, whether that's from a smartphone or something else. And it's not just for, like, how you get in and out of your house. I mean, they have it for people with dementia. So, for example, you can only open your medicine cabinet door once a day, for example. And so I do think that these concepts that are very powerful that we've evolved are moving there. And this is by way of an example. I want to give you another example that's a little closer to home. So as we all know, there's been a lot of advancements in vision and AI. This is used for things like lawful intercept and security cameras. And I have a personal experience with this. When we were doing Nicira, I think this is in 2011, we had a server that went missing. Now, the server happened to be the server of our most famous developer. And he could remember it like some 2 weeks before, and then it was just gone. So I still remember getting the email. The email was like, who took my server, basically? And nobody knew. And so we were just like, okay, maybe misplaced it, but who, how does it, a big, physical tower server get misplaced? So what we did is we're like, well, why don't we just start going through, the security feed, because it never did turn up. So we actually got the security camera feed that was on the back door, and this was 24 hours of security feed over a 2-week period. So I remember we'd go for lunch, and me and the actual security guard, who used to be a special forces guy, we'd sit there and we'd eat lunch and we'd look at this video camera, and then finally, okay, this is ridiculous because we're watching it every day. People are coming and going. Why don't we just end up watching it just at night? We ended up just watching it at night, and then he actually had kind of a smart idea. It's actually we have motion sensors on the security cameras, so why don't we do it anytime there's a motion sensor? And we finally, after about 4 days of hours of eating Chinese takeout and looking at these things, we actually saw someone take the server. And I actually have the video here that I want you to see. So this is the back door. 5 a.m. It's the first night in 4 days that somebody hadn't been there all night long. He's got a black mask on. He uses basically a lock set that'll go in and press the door from the inside that doesn't set off the security alarm. Watch when he breaks in, he doesn't look around. He goes in exactly the direction of where the server is. We speed it up there in less than 2 minutes. If you look closely, he's got an entire server under his arm. This is a time nobody was there. In 2 minutes, he was in and out. He went exactly to one person's desk. He entered the door that was closest to that desk. He passed a whole bunch of laptops on the way, right? And he got out. Now, we were very lucky for a number of things. A, this was a big server and it was a famous developer. B, we actually took the time to look at the security feed. I'm not sure how many people would do that, but we're very lucky to have actually seen this. Unfortunately, the FBI got involved, and they said actually this happens quite commonly in Silicon Valley. But there's a lot of these types of attacks that are happening, but they're very, very difficult to trace. And in fact, the guy, I think he drove a silver Honda Civic, and he had occluded the license plate, and he'd taken back roads. So we had security cameras up and down the street. We couldn't catch any of this, right? What's very interesting is if you look at a lot of the modern technologies that are being used for AI and surveillance cameras, it allows you to do things like full-on search for content within these things. So, for example, even on the consumer side, like Nest. So we'll see companies that come in and they'll say, listen, you can actually do a Google search on a video feed. So if you feed something like this into it, you could actually ask the question, show me everybody that enters from the back from the periods of 3 a.m. to 4 a.m., and it'll basically show you every one of those. And it's gotten so sophisticated that you can actually do unique identification based on the lawful intercept. It's not based on facial features, but how you walk and how you move. So in theory, you could say, show me anybody that enters and exits that isn't one of our employees, or is wearing a black mask or something like this. And so I do think that we're actually starting to see these very, very powerful features that we're applying outside of the security domain being applied now, and we're starting to see it. I've probably seen 10 companies in this space recently. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this as well, but of course in drones and robotics, we're seeing a lot of involvement too. We've got now security guards that are almost fully autonomous. So there is a security operations center on the back side, but they do have motion sensors. They do have vision detection. They will claim to detect whether someone's breaking into something or not just by using vision. Of course, we use drones now for a lot of the prisons and a lot of evolution. And so if I step back, I do think that it's very important, or a nice rubric to view security in this rubric of misalignment. I do think we're seeing a misalignment in the cyber side. And I actually really believe it's commensurate with like the creation of airplanes for flight is going to happen on the physical security side. Thanks very much.